I found out my husband's family had already decided my future without ever asking me, because the life growing inside me wasn't the child they wanted. And in that moment, I realized their love had never been love at all. It was a contract.
My name is Nia Carter, and this is the story of how I stopped asking to be chosen, exposed a family that mistook cruelty for tradition, and reclaimed my dignity the moment they thought I would stay silent. I used to believe pain came from loud moments, from shouting and slammed doors, from words that were meant to hurt. What I learned in my marriage is that the deepest pain is quiet, polite, and patient. It shows up dressed as concern, wrapped in tradition, disguised as love. When I met Darius Langston, I thought I had finally found a man who felt safe. He was calm where I was intense, measured where I was expressive. I mistook his restraint for strength and his silence for loyalty. I didn't yet understand that silence can also be a refusal to protect. I was 37 when I got pregnant, old enough to know who I was, old enough to think I wouldn't be molded by anyone else's expectations. I had already lived a full life before Darius. I had loved before, failed before, learned to stand back up on my own before. I came from a family that believed respect was something you practiced every day, not something you demanded. My mother raised me to speak clearly, to never beg for a seat at a table, and to leave rooms where my presence had to be negotiated. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that marriage required different rules. From the beginning, Darius's family treated me like a resume. Rosalind Langston, his mother, never asked who I was. She assessed what I represented. She asked about my parents' marriage, my education, my discipline. Her compliments were always conditional. I was articulate, but she worried about how I'd sound around certain people. I was pretty, but she reminded me beauty fades. She spoke about family as if it were an institution I was applying to, not a bond you entered with love. When I tried to laugh things off, she smiled as though I'd passed a small test. At family gatherings, I learned my place quickly. Conversation shifted when I entered the room. Decisions were made without me and explained later as if I'd missed something obvious. When I spoke, Rosalind would tilt her head and say, "That's interesting," in a way that shut everything down. Darius noticed these moments. I know he did. But instead of naming them, he translated them for me. "She doesn't mean it like that. You know how she is. Let's not make it a thing." Each time he asked me to be patient, he was really asking me to be smaller. The family's obsession with sons showed up early, long before I was pregnant. Rosalind talked about men as anchors, as proof that a family mattered. She praised her nephews for carrying the blood, spoke about inheritance like it was holy scripture. Daughters were spoken of fondly but lightly, like accessories that eventually leave the house. When I asked once, half joking, what would happen if we had a girl, Rosalind smiled and said, "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it." I laughed too, even though something in me tightened. Pregnancy changed the tone of everything. Suddenly, my body wasn't mine. It belonged to the future they imagined. Every check-in felt like surveillance. Every question had an edge. They spoke about names, about legacy, about what this child would mean for the family, never about who this child might be. Darius started repeating his mother's phrases without realizing it. "It's bigger than us. This is about generations." When I asked him where I fit into those generations, he kissed my forehead and said I was overthinking. The hardest part wasn't the cruelty, it was the loneliness. I felt alone even when I was surrounded by people. I felt alone when Darius sat beside me and chose harmony over honesty. I felt alone when I rehearsed conversations in my head, that I knew I would never have out loud because I already knew how they would end. The only person who ever saw me clearly was Aunt Denise. She was Rosalind's younger sister, sharp-eyed, soft-spoken, and allergic to nonsense. When she hugged me, it felt like permission to breathe. She never challenged Rosalind publicly, but she never fed her power either. "Pay attention," she once whispered to me after a family dinner. "They show you who they are in pieces." I told myself that enduring discomfort was part of commitment. I told myself that love required translation, patience, forgiveness. I ignored the quiet erosion of my self-respect because nothing terrible had happened yet. I didn't realize that I was slowly being trained to accept conditions, that I was being prepared to understand my worth through someone else's approval. By the time I realized how much ground I'd lost, the stakes were no longer just mine. There was a child involved now, a future that would either inherit my silence or my voice. Looking back, the signs were always there. The way Darius never contradicted his mother, only redirected her. The way decisions were framed as tradition instead of choice. The way I was praised most when I complied. None of it was explosive. All of it was effective. I didn't feel abused, I felt managed. And that made it harder to name, harder to fight, harder to explain even to myself. I didn't know yet that the worst moment was coming, that everything I'd swallowed would soon demand a reckoning. I only knew that something inside me was shifting, that endurance was starting to feel like self-betrayal, and that the love I was protecting might not be protecting me at all. The day of the gender reveal arrived wrapped in performance. Smiles were rehearsed, laughter placed carefully, affection displayed like proof of unity. I moved through the house as if I were already watching myself from a distance, aware that something fragile was about to break. I had the envelope from my appointment tucked deep in my bag, unopened, but I already knew what it said. I had known for days. I just hadn't said it out loud yet, as if silence could delay consequence. That morning, Rosalind was everywhere. She corrected the placement of decorations, adjusted people's posture for photos, narrated the event as though it were already a success story. "This is a big day for our family," she kept saying, emphasizing our like it was proprietary. Darius stayed close to her, attentive in a way that made me feel invisible. When I caught his eye, he smiled quickly, reassuringly, the way you do when you sense tension but don't want to acknowledge it. A few hours before guests arrived, I stepped away to the kitchen to breathe. I told myself I was being dramatic, that pregnancy makes everything feel heavier. I set my phone down on the counter, recording a short message for the baby, something private I planned to keep. My voice sounded steady as I spoke about hope, about love, about choosing courage. Then I realized I'd forgotten water and stepped just outside the doorway, leaving the phone where it was. That's when I heard her. Rosalind's voice didn't carry urgency or anger. It carried certainty. "If it's a girl," she said, calm and composed, "you need to understand what that means." There was a pause, not because she doubted herself, but because she expected agreement. "We are not building a legacy on a daughter. You know what's expected of you. Don't embarrass this family by pretending otherwise." I waited for Darius to interrupt her. I waited for him to say my name, to say our child's name, to say anything that sounded like a boundary. Instead, he exhaled softly and said, "We'll see, Mom." Not a defense, not a refusal, an opening. Something inside me dropped, not sharply, but completely. I realized in that moment that my marriage had always been conditional, that love here came with clauses I'd never been shown. I wasn't devastated because I feared losing him. I was devastated because I heard how easily he imagined leaving, because he didn't even need to ask himself if it was wrong. I stepped back before they could see me. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I felt strangely calm, as if my body had accepted a truth my heart had been avoiding. When Denise appeared beside me, she didn't ask questions. She looked at my face and said quietly, "You heard it too." I nodded. She didn't touch me right away. She let the moment exist, let me register it without rushing me into comfort. The rest of the afternoon moved forward as planned, but I was no longer inside it. Guests arrived, music played, laughter rose and fell. Rosalind hugged people and spoke about blessings. Darius played the role of devoted husband, his hand warm on my back, his smile confident. I watched him closely, noticing how easily he shifted between versions of himself. I wondered how long he'd been practicing. There was a second layer of humiliation that night, one they didn't even realize they were delivering. Rosalind made a toast before the reveal, talking about strength, about sons carrying responsibility, about the pride of a family name. People clapped politely, some enthusiastically. I stood beside her, visibly pregnant, listening to a future I was apparently meant to deliver or disappear from. Darius squeezed my hand once, as if to say, "Just get through it." I almost broke them. Not loudly, quietly, inwardly. I felt the familiar urge to smooth things over, to excuse intentions, to remind myself that this was stress, not cruelty. I thought about my mother's voice in my head, telling me not to negotiate my dignity. I thought about the baby inside me, about what it would mean for her to grow up watching me disappear in small ways. That thought steadied me more than anything else. They believed I would stay silent. They believed I would smile, accept whatever outcome they decided, and handle the rest privately. That belief gave them confidence. It made them callous. They didn't notice that I wasn't reacting the way I usually did. They didn't notice that I stopped translating their behavior into something palatable. They didn't notice that I had stopped hoping. By the time the sun started to dip and guests gathered closer, anticipation thick in the air, I felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Resolve. Not rage. Not revenge. Clarity. I knew exactly what had been taken from me, and I knew exactly what I would not allow to be taken from my child. Whatever happened next would not be an argument or a plea. It would be a decision. I wasn't asking to be chosen anymore. I was choosing myself. I didn't sleep that night, but not because I was spiraling. My mind was working with a precision I hadn't felt in years. Grief usually comes with noise, panic, tears, questions, but what I felt was organization. The conversation I'd overheard replayed itself, not as pain anymore, but as data. I stopped asking why they were like this and started asking how they operated. Those are very different questions, and one of them gives you leverage. The first thing I did was listen to the recording. Not once, not twice, over and over until my emotions detached from it and I could hear it the way a stranger would. Rosalind's voice was unmistakable, controlled, calm, authoritative. She wasn't angry or flustered. She sounded like someone stating policy. Darius sounded exactly the way he always did when conflict threatened his comfort. Agreeable without committing, non-confrontational to the point of betrayal. I realized then that the recording didn't need editing or framing. It explained itself. I backed it up immediately. Cloud storage, a physical drive, and one direct message to Denise with a simple line, "Please keep this safe." She replied within minutes. Already done. That was when I understood how alone I hadn't been. She hadn't challenged her sister for years, not because she was weak, but because she was waiting. Some people survive by staying quiet until the truth gives them permission to speak. The next step was understanding the battlefield. This wasn't about a private confrontation. A private confrontation would be dismissed, minimized, reframed. This family thrived on closed doors and selective memory. If I wanted truth to land, it had to land where they built their image. In front of witnesses. In the space where they were most careful. I wasn't interested in humiliation for its own sake. I wanted clarity, and clarity requires light. I reviewed the plan for the gender reveal as if I were an outsider. The order of events, the timing, the emotional rhythm of the night. I saw where attention would peak and where defenses would be down. That's where truth belongs, not screamed in chaos, but delivered when people are listening. I approached the videographer the next morning under the guise of sentimentality. I asked if we could add a short montage before the reveal. Something meaningful, I said. Something honest, he smiled, flattered by the trust. I built the sequence myself. I started with photos everyone loved. Holidays, laughter, my pregnancy, the illusion of unity. I let the warmth settle in. Then I placed the audio. No captions, no commentary, just sound. I knew exactly how long it needed to play to do its work without becoming spectacle. Long enough to be undeniable, short enough to be irreversible. Externally, I played my role flawlessly. I thanked Rosalind for her help. I laughed at Darius's jokes. I reassured guests who asked if I was nervous. Inside, I watched everything. I noticed how Rosalind coached conversations, how she positioned herself near influence, how she managed perception. I noticed how Darius avoided eye contact when decisions came up, how often he deferred to his mother, even in small things. These observations didn't hurt anymore. They confirmed. There was one moment of risk that almost exposed everything. Rosalind asked to review the video before the event, citing quality control. My heart didn't race. I smiled and said the file was already exported and locked for the screen system. A small lie, necessary. She hesitated, her instincts pricking, but Denise stepped in smoothly, redirecting her attention to guests arriving early. Later, Denise squeezed my arm and said quietly, "You handled that." In the days leading up to the reveal, I spoke to a lawyer, not to threaten anyone, not to prepare a fight, but to draw a line. Custody, boundaries, protection. I needed to know what power looked like when it wasn't emotional. The lawyer listened carefully and said something that stayed with me. You're not reacting, you're deciding. That distinction mattered. By the time the event arrived, I felt steady. Not numb. Steady. My fear had transformed into focus. I wasn't thinking about what I might lose. I was thinking about what I was refusing to pass down. I thought about my daughter inheriting a world where her worth would be debated before she ever spoke. And I knew this moment, this public truth, was the first boundary I would ever set for her. When guests began to gather, laughter filling the space, I felt ready. Not triumphant, prepared. The difference is important. Triumph is loud. Preparation is quiet. I took one last look at the recording on my phone, not to reassure myself, but to remind myself why I was doing this. Then I turned the screen off and stepped into the room. Timing, I'd learned, is power, and for the first time in my marriage, the timing was mine. By the time everyone was assembled, the room looked exactly like the kind of family moment people love to post and replay. Faces angled toward the screen, phones raised, smiles ready. There was a sweetness in the air that almost felt real, and for a flicker of a second, I mourned what this could have been if love hadn't been treated like a transaction. Then I felt my daughter move, a small, firm reminder inside me, and the mourning turned into resolve again. Rosalind stood near the front like she belonged there, dressed with intention, chin lifted, the kind of woman who could make cruelty sound like standards. Darius stayed close to her, playing both devoted husband and dutiful son, without seeming to notice the contradiction. Denise hovered to the side, quiet but present, her eyes on me like an anchor. I caught her gaze, and she gave me a small nod that said, "I'm here, and I'm not moving." Someone called for me to say a few words, as if that was just part of the tradition. I took the microphone and felt the weight of everyone's attention settle on my shoulders. This was the moment they assumed would be soft. Tears, gratitude, a sentimental speech about blessings and family. They expected me to be tender and manageable. I smiled, just enough to keep the room open. "I want to say something before we reveal the baby," I began, and my voice sounded steady, almost warm. I could feel Darius relax slightly beside me, like he thought the tension he'd sensed all week was finally dissolving into something harmless. I let him believe that for 2 more seconds. "I've been thinking a lot about what it means to build a family," I continued, looking slowly across the faces in front of me. "Not just what we celebrate in public, but what we say in private, the things we call tradition, the things we call love, the stories we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night." A few people murmured approval, the kind you give when you think someone is about to say something beautiful. Rosalind smiled, satisfied, like she'd trained me well. Darius squeezed my hand, and I felt how badly he wanted this to be simple. "I made a short montage," I said. "Something we can keep, something we can remember this moment by." The videographer nodded and tapped the cue, and the screen lit up. At first, it was exactly what they expected. Photos of me and Darius laughing, hands intertwined, him kissing my cheek, us holding the first ultrasound image. Guests smiled wider, some sighing. Rosalind looked pleased, like this was evidence of her successful family. Darius leaned closer, his expression softening as the room warmed around us. Then the audio shifted. It wasn't dramatic music or a voiceover. It was a raw, unpolished sound from a kitchen. Footsteps, the faint hum of appliances, and then Rosalind's voice, clear as daylight. "If it's a girl, you leave her. We are not raising a legacy on a daughter. Don't embarrass this family." The room went still so fast, it felt like the air itself had been snatched away. The kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat, makes you notice how loud one inhale can be. Then Darius's voice followed, smaller but unmistakable. "We'll see, Mom." A woman near the back let out a sharp gasp that sounded like pain. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God," not as gossip, but as recognition. Heads turned, not toward me first, but toward Rosalind, because her voice had been the first betrayal in the room. Rosalind's face changed in stages, shock, then anger, then an instinctive attempt to control. Her mouth opened as if she could edit what people had heard by speaking over it, but she couldn't. Sound doesn't unsay itself. You can't politely explain away a sentence like that, not when it lands on an audience that heard it together. Darius stepped forward, reaching for my arm. "Nia," he hissed under his breath, a warning wrapped in my name. His eyes were wide, not with concern for me, but with panic for himself. I looked at him and saw clearly what I had been protecting for years. His comfort, his image, his illusion of being a good man without ever having to act like one. I stepped away from his hand, not dramatically, just decisively, the kind of movement that says, "I'm no longer available for your version of this story." Rosalind found her voice. "This is out of context," she snapped, too loud, too fast. "This is private family talk. This is—" She stopped because she realized what she sounded like, a woman defending cruelty by calling it private. I lifted the microphone again, and the sound system carried my calm through the room. There is no context, I said, evenly. There's only truth. Darius tried again, quieter this time. Can we talk? He pleaded, and that word, pleaded, hit different than any apology. It wasn't remorse. It was damage control. I turned back to the crowd. Now, I said, we can reveal the baby. Someone near the front hesitated, unsure if it was even appropriate to continue, but the balloon was already there, hovering, part of the set. I reached out and popped it myself. Pink powder bloomed into the air like smoke, drifting upward, settling over the scene like a verdict. A girl. For a moment, no one reacted because everyone was processing two truths at once, the joy of new life and the ugliness of the conditions placed on it. Then the murmurs started, not celebratory, but stunned. People looked at Rosalind with something like disgust. People looked at Darius with something like disappointment. You could see their mental pictures of this family cracking because the image they'd been fed didn't match the sound they'd heard. Rosalind's control slipped. "This is an attack," she said, her voice trembling now, rage turning desperate. "She's trying to make us look—" "You did that," Denise cut in, stepping forward. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried because everyone wanted to hear someone finally say it. Denise's face was composed, but her eyes were hard. "You did that to yourself." Rosalind stared at her sister like she couldn't believe the betrayal. Denise didn't blink. She moved to my side and placed her arm around my shoulders, not as protection, but as solidarity. It changed the room again. Because when someone from inside the family stands with you, it becomes harder for outsiders to dismiss you as emotional or dramatic. Darius looked between us like he was trying to find a way out. "Nia, please," he said, and I almost laughed at the word please because it was the first time he'd ever used it with me when his mother was watching. I leaned toward the microphone one last time. "I'm not here to argue," I said, and my voice softened just enough to sound human, not sharp. "I'm here to make sure my daughter is never treated like a disappointment, not by strangers and not by family." Rosalind lunged for the microphone as if she could snatch the moment back, but two of her friends, women who had smiled with her in church and praised her generosity, moved subtly in her path, not touching her, but blocking her. That was the real collapse. The social protection she relied on wasn't automatic anymore. I looked at Darius then, truly looked. "You heard her?" I said quietly, so only he could hear. "And you gave her room?" His eyes filled, and for a second I wondered if this would be the moment he finally understood. Then he glanced toward his mother, and I saw the old reflex return, the loyalty that always came at my expense. That was my answer. I handed the microphone back, not to Rosalind, not to Darius, but to the videographer, and I stepped away from the center of the room. Denise stayed with me. We walked through the stunned crowd as whispers followed, not about me, but about them. I heard a man say, "That's sick," and I knew he wasn't talking about my decision. At the door, Darius called my name again, louder, like volume could fix what truth had broken. "Nia, don't do this." I turned, not because I owed him comfort, but because I wanted him to see my face when I made my choice. "I didn't do this," I said. I stopped hiding it. Then I walked out into the night air with Denise beside me, and for the first time in a long time, my chest felt open, like I could breathe without permission. Leaving that party felt like stepping off a stage and realizing you'd been performing for years without knowing it. The noise stayed behind the door, voices rising, chairs scraping, someone calling my name like a prayer and a warning at the same time. But inside the car, it was just my breathing and Denise's steady presence. My hands were still calm on my lap. That scared me for a moment, Because calm can look like numbness when you don't recognize it as strength yet. Denise didn't ask me if I was okay. She didn't say, "I'm proud of you," or "You did the right thing," because she understood something most people don't. A woman doesn't need validation in the moment she finally chooses herself. What she needs is space to feel what choosing costs. Denise just drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, and said, "I'm taking you to my place tonight." It wasn't a question. It was shelter. On the ride, my mind kept reaching backward, collecting every time I had gone quiet to keep peace. I thought about the first time Rosalind corrected me in public, laughing softly when I said something the family didn't approve of, and how I laughed too, so I wouldn't seem sensitive. I thought about the way I stopped telling Darius certain truths because he always responded with discomfort, like my feelings were an inconvenience. I thought about the small rituals of self-censorship I had adopted without noticing, rephrasing my opinions, lowering my voice, smiling through tension, letting comments slide because confronting them felt like work I'd have to do alone. And that's the thing about silence. People call it weakness, but for a long time, my silence was survival. It was strategy. When you're outnumbered, when you're inside someone else's family system, silence can feel like the only way to keep yourself from being labeled the problem. I wasn't quiet because I didn't know my worth. I was quiet because I understood the cost of being loud in a room where no one planned to listen. I believed that if I kept things smooth, love would eventually soften them. I believed endurance could teach people empathy. I was wrong. What my silence did over time was teach them that my boundaries were negotiable. It taught Rosalind that she could measure me without consequence. It taught Darius that he could avoid conflict and still keep me. It taught the whole family that my dignity would always come second to their comfort. And the scariest part is how quickly that lesson becomes normal. You don't wake up one morning and decide to erase yourself. You do it in increments. One swallowed comment. One forced smile. One apology you didn't owe. One moment where you choose peace over truth and call it maturity. By the time Denise pulled into her driveway, I felt the weight of my own complicity, not in their cruelty, but in the way I had protected it from exposure. I had been the buffer that kept their image intact. I had been the translator that made their disrespect sound like stress. I had been the one who kept the room comfortable, even when the comfort was built on my silence. Inside Denise's home, she made me sit, not like a guest, but like family. She handed me water and said, "Eat something later, not because you're weak, because you're carrying life." That sentence hit me harder than comfort. It reminded me that my body wasn't just mine anymore, and that what I modeled now would become my daughter's blueprint for womanhood. The phone started buzzing almost immediately. Darius. Then Rosalind. Then numbers I recognized as family friends who would normally only call on holidays. The first few times I just stared at the screen, watching names flash like old obligations. Denise glanced at me and said, "You don't have to answer anything tonight." Her voice wasn't permissive, it was firm. Like she was giving me back authority over my own time. But I did answer Darius eventually, not because I owed him, but because I needed to hear what he would choose now that the world had witnessed his silence. I stepped into the quiet of Denise's hallway and picked up. "Nia," he said, and his voice sounded raw, like he wanted me to mistake panic for pain. "What you did was, you didn't have to do that." That sentence told me everything. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I failed you." Not, "My mother was wrong." Just, "You didn't have to expose us." "I didn't expose you," I said, and my voice surprised me with how level it was. "I played you. There's a difference." He swallowed audibly. My mom didn't mean it like that. She was just talking. She said, if our baby is a girl, you should leave me, I replied. And you gave her an answer that made her comfortable. I said, we'll see, he insisted, like that was neutrality. I didn't agree. I leaned my head back against the wall, eyes closed, letting myself feel the old urge to explain, to teach, to guide him toward decency. Then I remembered how exhausted I was of doing that work alone. Darius, I said quietly, a good man doesn't need a perfect sentence to protect his wife. He just protects her. He went silent, then tried again. Can we talk in person? We can fix this. That word fix used to work on me. It used to make me think of effort, repair, growth. Now it sounded like erasing consequences. You want to fix the image, I said. I want to protect my daughter. She's my daughter too, he snapped, the first flash of anger slipping through his fear. And that's exactly why I'm doing this, I replied. Because a father who lets someone call her a disappointment before she's even born is not safe for her. He started to cry then, or at least his breathing changed like he wanted me to believe he was. Nia, please, I love you. I looked down at my belly, my hand pressing lightly, as if my daughter could hear my thoughts. I realized something sharp and clean. Love without protection is just a word people use when they want access to you. If you loved me, I said, you wouldn't be arguing about whether your mother's cruelty deserved privacy. I ended the call, not dramatically, just final. The phone stopped being a weapon the moment I refused to let it dictate my nervous system. The next morning, the aftermath arrived like weather. Messages. Voicemails. Some were furious, accusing me of being disrespectful, dramatic, ungrateful. Others were softer, laced with shame. A few people, women who had smiled at Rosalind for years, sent brief notes that said, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Those words mattered, not because they healed me, but because they cracked the illusion that Rosalind's behavior was normal or acceptable. Denise made coffee and sat across from me like she was preparing for a long conversation. Your silence kept you alive in that house, she said, as if reading my mind. But it also fed her. Rosalind doesn't understand boundaries unless she hits one. I stared at the steam rising from the mug, feeling the truth of that settle in my chest. I let it go on too long, I admitted, and my voice broke for the first time since the party. Not because I regretted what I did, but because I realized how much I had endured in order to be loved. Denise didn't disagree. She didn't comfort me with lies. She just said, "You're stopping it now." Over the next days, the public story began to form, and I watched it like an outsider. People at church whispered. Friends of the family stopped smiling at Rosalind the same way. Her kindness suddenly looked like control. Her reputation didn't collapse in one dramatic explosion. It fractured in many small moments as people replayed the audio in their heads and realized what kind of woman could say that about an unborn child. Some still defended her, of course. Toxic systems always have loyal soldiers. But the difference was that now the defense sounded strained, rehearsed, less confident. Rosalind tried to contact me through other people, which told me she still believed she could manage me. A cousin messaged that I should be the bigger person. An older family friend said, "You know how she is, don't take it personal." Those phrases used to trap me because they framed disrespect as something I had to absorb in order to prove maturity. Now I heard them clearly as instructions to stay quiet so others could stay comfortable. I met with my lawyer again and started the separation process with clarity, not rage. Papers, boundaries, agreements. It wasn't revenge, it was protection. I didn't want revenge that would leave me tied to them through bitterness. I wanted a clean line my daughter could grow up on one side of. When I finally sat alone, truly alone, I expected fear to hit me. I expected loneliness. Instead, I felt relief so intense it made me cry. Not the kind of tears that beg, the kind that release. I realized I had been more afraid of being without them than I had been of what they were doing to me, and that fear had been keeping me obedient. The hardest grief was not losing Darius. It was losing the version of myself who believed endurance was love. I had built an identity around being understanding, patient, strong in the way people praise women for tolerating what men would never tolerate. I had mistaken survival for virtue. I had believed that if I could just hold on long enough, I would earn respect. But respect is not earned through suffering. It is either given freely or withheld deliberately. One afternoon, Denise and I sat on her porch, the air quiet, the world moving without asking my permission. She said, "You know what legacy is?" I shook my head, and she smiled softly. Legacy is what your daughter will remember about how you treated yourself. That thought settled into me like a vow. I pictured my daughter as a little girl watching me, learning what a woman should accept. I pictured her as a teenager hearing someone speak to her with disdain and wondering if she should shrink. I pictured her as grown, choosing partners, choosing friends, choosing what kind of love she believed she deserved. And I knew my job was not to keep her father's family comfortable. My job was to show her that dignity isn't loud, it's firm. It's the refusal to negotiate your humanity. I didn't walk away from that party with a perfect life. I walked away with truth, and truth has consequences. But the consequences were clean. They were real. They were mine. In the weeks that followed, Darius tried to repair the damage in small ways. Flowers, apologies that arrived late, promises that sounded like bargaining. Rosalind tried to reclaim control with shame. But none of it landed the way it used to, because the moment I spoke truth publicly, I changed the rules. They could no longer punish me with silence. I had already survived it. And the strangest part was realizing that my silence was still mine, just in a different form. Before, my silence was submission. Now, my silence was choice. I didn't argue with every message. I didn't defend myself to every person who tried to reframe what happened. I didn't perform pain to prove I deserved empathy. I moved with calm because calm was my boundary, and boundaries don't need applause. I began to feel free, not in a carefree, romantic way, but in the way someone feels when they finally stop living under a threat they didn't name. I had been living under the threat of being abandoned, the threat of being judged, the threat of being rejected. Once the worst truth was spoken out loud, the threat lost its power. The monster was in the light now, and it looked smaller than it had in the dark. I didn't win a family that night. I didn't win a husband who suddenly transformed into the protector I deserved. What I won was myself. I won the ability to hear my own voice without apologizing for it. I won the understanding that my daughter would never have to earn her place by meeting someone else's conditions. And that victory, once claimed, doesn't ask permission to stay.